In 1976, one-term Georgia governor and Washington outsider Jimmy Carter defeated Gerald Ford to earn the right to be President of the United States. On paper, Carter was hardly a traditional presidential candidate, but after two infamous presidencies of career politicians, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, Americans were desperate for a fresh face. Although oil shocks first hit the United States in the 1970s, tension in the Middle East later in the decade led to an increasingly volatile petroleum market. As a result, Carter was proactive in his efforts to explore both alternative energy forms to oil, as well as pursue conservation efforts. While some programs were more effective and popular than others, Carter's installation of solar panels on the White House roof represented a significant departure from previous administrations. Beginning in the late 1960s, an environmental crisis had gripped America. Groundwater was contaminated, smog levels were abnormally high. In fact, some rivers, as a result of increased toxicity, actually caught on fire. As a result, Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, but only under Carter did alternative energy forms begin to be researched in earnest. Back to the solar panels. The installation in reality was unlikely to make a major dent in the power bill at the White House, but Carter's decision was symbolic. It showed that as president, he was not aloof to the problems that affected ordinary Americans, and that he would make a concerted effort to practice what he preached. While solar panels in the 1970s were quite expensive, and remain so to this day for the purpose of personal home usage, Carter convinced Congress to provide significant tax breaks to families who used alternative technology. A less popular gesture was Carter's decision to establish temperature controls in federal buildings. Due to the rising cost of oil, Washington power bills were going through the roof. As a result, Carter decided that in the summertime, federal buildings would be kept no cooler than 78 degrees. In wintertime, that number fell to 65 degrees. Unfortunately, much like the solar panel installation, this practice of Carter's lacked much more authority than a gesture. Individual private citizens were not constrained by such temperature controls. Other components of the energy conservation in the 1970s involved the increasing American demand for oil. While at the beginning of the decade, the U.S. relied on foreign oil for less than 25% of its reserves, by the end of the decade, that figure had nearly doubled, to 47%. The primary culprit for increased American demand was an ever-expanding interstate highway system and new industries in the South. And while the highways allowed easier travel, considering the remarkably expensive cost of air travel, more cars on the road meant that the United States became more vulnerable to price increases. A final energy-related event of the Carter administration involved the near meltdown of a nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Critics of nuclear power cited the waste that was produced and the inability to discard said toxic waste. Proponents cited inexpensive power and a decreased reliance on an increasingly volatile energy market. But despite the low cost, the close call of making a large part of the Northeast unlivable led to a decline in the popularity of nuclear power. Future dangers would expose themselves in the USSR in 1986, when a nuclear power plant malfunctioned in Chernobyl, blanketing a huge swath of land in sky-high radiation levels. While regulation, particularly in finance, had become a hot topic in the wake of the recent financial crisis in 2008, the practice truly spun into high gear, albeit in a different way, during the Carter presidency. While Nixon's deregulation practices were structured via his new federalism policies, Carter was much more proactive when it came to opening certain markets. That being said, Carter was not exclusively an advocate of small government. In the early part of his presidency, he established new federal departments, energy and education, although he effectively negated conservative criticism in regard through incremental deregulation. The first market Carter sought to liberalize as president was the airline industry. Much like the railroads of the 19th century, the airline industry in the 20th century was tightly controlled by the government. But Carter, noting the malaise of the government-owned railway system which continued to operate unprofitable routes, eventually leading to its phasing out, was determined to help airlines avoid a similar fate. Prior to the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, prices were set federally, routes were fixed, and the tight policy prevented new companies from entering the market. While leaving air safety untouched, the ADA created a competitive market which would determine the quality, price, and variety of air service. To put the act in more tangible terms, The lifting of price controls allowed new airline carriers to emerge, offering cheaper fares on routes some airlines formerly held a virtually monopoly on. For example, in 1974, the cheapest fare for a round-trip ticket from New York to LA was over $1,400. Now, that same seat could be purchased for under $300. While some airlines who struggled to adjust their policies went under, notably Braniff and eventually Pan Am and TWA, other small carriers predicated upon low cost and regional service thrived. The airlines many of us use today, like Southwest, Frontier, and AirTran, were made possible through the ADA of 1978. Additionally, routes that were less busy were minimized or even eventually phased out. No longer could providers continue routes from Houston to Billings, Montana, if the flight was half full. With plummeting fares and increased competition, it was harder for companies who did not adapt to ensure that revenues outpaced expenses. But for travelers, this deregulation was fantastic. In the financial sector, Carter initiated a process that was adopted and enhanced during the 1980s and beyond. As a result of the Great Depression, FDR ushered in numerous financial reforms in an effort to create sector stability. But going on 40 years later, many Americans believed such tight control of monetary policy was simply not needed. The Deregulation Act of 1980 was designed to enhance profits. While tax rates remained high, the lessening of other restrictions paved the way for financial windfall. The Deregulation Act, which was dubbed DID-MCA, lowered mandatory reserve requirements for banks. This enabled banks to invest more client money, which led to higher interest earnings. At the same time, FDIC requirements were increased. Federal deposit insurance had been established in the wake of the Depression as a means of insuring citizen fortunes should a bank go out of business. Additionally, the Act invalidated state laws that set minimum interest rates. As a result, the loan business blossomed. From the 1940s through the early 70s, the American economy had experienced solid growth. The era even became known as the Great Prosperity. But the economic success was built on a restrained market economy. When some of those policies began to be lessened under Carter, the foundation for economic instability was inadvertently built. While crises in Iran and Afghanistan dominated Carter's latter years in Washington, early in his administration he experienced some solid successes. The Panama Canal treaties shifted control of the canal to Panama. After the failure in Vietnam, many Americans were vocal about lessening the nation's imperialistic presence abroad, of which the canal was a symbol. Additionally, up until this point, the United States had been providing security for the region. What the treaty effectively did was shift majority defense responsibility to Panama, with the U.S. reserving the right to intervene if its national interests were threatened, while still ensuring custom monies. Just less of it, still made its way to the Federal Reserve. Many Republicans were critical of the treaty as an example of the Democrats' lack of belief in American exceptionalism, a critique that remains in use to this day. Without question, Carter's biggest success as president was the signing of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt in 1978. Dating back to the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel had seized the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and was able to deter, in part thanks to American aid, an Egyptian assault 6 years later. Ever since its foundings in the late 1940s, Israel had attracted the scorn and hatred of its neighbors. The entire Middle East did not even recognize Israel's right to exist. Impressively, Carter was the one who was able to establish a truce between Israel and Egypt. Fearful of lingering threats, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin agreed to return Sinai to the Egyptians, as long as the Egyptian president, Anwar al-Sadat, would recognize Israel's legitimacy. Sadat's agreement was revolutionary in that it represented the first time an Arab nation recognized Israel's right to exist. That being said, while the treaty was hailed as a success, it was short-lived. Sadat was assassinated in 1981, and violence in that region had persisted for the last 3 decades, just not between the two aforementioned nations. Building off of Nixon's SALT I treaty with the Soviets in the early 1970s, Jimmy Carter attempted to negotiate an additional arms limitation treaty later in the decade. SALT II banned new missile programs, although there were some exceptions, and was ratified by the Senate. It appeared as though détente had continued to blossom during the Carter administration. However, 6 months after its signing, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, not only ending détente, but eventually leading to Ronald Reagan's discarding of the SALT II treaty in 1986. For centuries, Afghanistan's mountainous topography had prevented foreign nations from achieving occupation. Alexander the Great learned the hard way, as did the Soviet Union, and more recently the United States. But for the USSR, the seed that sowed its defeat looked at first like a pleasant surprise. In 1978, a communist junta overthrew the existing Afghan regime. For a nation that was very much experiencing a faltering economy, this looked like a coup for the Soviets, who could potentially use the nation as a pathway to the oil-rich Middle East. However, it was quickly discovered how tenuous the power of the communist government was. Much like Warsaw Pact nations that relied on the USSR for military protection and funding, Afghanistan, despite a lack of membership, wanted to benefit from the same generosity. In Prague in 1968, a Czech protest movement threatened the existing communist regime, only to be put down with the full military might of the Red Army. So when an Islamic fundamentalist movement swept Central Asia, with the common bond of removing the Soviet puppet government, a precedent that had already been set for Soviet intervention. Carter condemned the Soviet invasion as an end of détente, but most of Carter's response lacked vigor. Carter decided that American athletes would boycott the Moscow Olympics, and that the United States would not abide by the new SALT II regulations. While the Olympic boycott was intended to punish the Soviets, instead it simply hurt American athletes who had trained their whole lives to participate in the Games. Back to the war, while the United States had no desire to get involved directly, President Carter immediately began the process of funneling aid to Muslim combatants in the region. Heeding the advice of his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter saw an opportunity through aid to rebels of luring the Soviets into a conflict that was eerily similar to the American experience in Vietnam: unfamiliar terrain, lack of centralized government, enemies that were difficult to identify, etc. In a decision that seemed practical at the time, the United States decided to arm the most radical of the Islamic factions. In continuing the trend of providing aid to unsavory characters, funneling CIA aid through Pakistan, the U.S. helped finance a mujahideen under the leadership of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a man who was notorious for throwing acid in the face of women whose faces were uncovered. Brzezinski and Carter also believed that propping up the mujahideen would lead to a wave of Islamic nationalism that would sweep through the southern part of the USSR, a place with large Muslim populations, inciting similar geographic reorganization and revolution that struck Europe after World War I. American interest in and proactivity in the Middle East during the 1950s was not exclusive to Israel. When Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister in Iran and began taking action to nationalize Iranian oil fields, his behavior struck the United States as similar to Soviet collectivization. And although American reliance on foreign oil in the 50s was minimal, the potential for the Soviets to develop a relationship with Iran and later seize control of the region was not out of the realm of possibility. Via the CIA, the United States organized the overthrow of Mossadegh and installed Shah Pahlavi as the new head of the Iranian state. While Mossadegh was a man who patterned policy to complement the desires of his constituents, the Shah was aloof to the troubles of ordinary Iranians. Instead of continuing policies that helped the disadvantaged, the Shah spent millions on lavish parties and objects. In one example of ridiculous excess, to celebrate the anniversary of ancient Persia, the Shah spent hundreds of millions of dollars to reconstruct temples of a bygone era. All the while, Iranian poor were struggling to survive. In a sense, the spendthrift practices of Louis XVI in revolutionary France had resurfaced in Iran, but the Shah combined Louis's excessiveness with brutal repression. With an increasingly frustrated populace, Iranians voiced their displeasure. To combat the sedition, the Shah used a brutal police state, known as Savak, to quell dissent and eliminate adversaries. Savak was similar to the Nazi SS, but the United States tolerated the Shah's horrors because he was an anti-communist. The Shah's excess, Savak, and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism eventually contributed to the Iranian Revolution in 1978. Sensing that even his paramilitary guard could not ensure his safety, the Shah fled the country. Around the same time, anti-Americanism in Iran was on the rise. Some Americans were living in Iran during the time and were enjoying lives of excess, thanks to their close ties to the Shah. But when the Shah fled, these former beneficiaries became fair game. In the late 1970s, the Shah sought cancer treatment in the United States and was allowed entry by Carter. By this time, the Ayatollah Khomeini had risen to power in Iran, establishing an Islamic republic. Khomeini demanded the United States deport the Shah so that he would stand trial in Iran, but Carter was aware such a decision would certainly lead to the Shah's execution. As a result, in 1978, in November, revolutionary students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 hostages. In an ordeal that would last over a year, Americans nightly turned to the news for information about the hostages. Also in a cruel twist, while television coverage became increasingly omnipresent, the constant coverage of the events in Tehran helped contribute to Carter's downfall. Initially, Iranian students had no interest in negotiating for the release of the hostages, and Carter's inability to rescue them, most obviously seen in the doomed Operation Eagle Claw that led to 8 deaths following a helicopter crash in the Iranian desert, illustrated that despite America's military might, it was powerless in parts of the world. Eventually, the economic sanctions that had been instituted at the beginning of the crisis began to take a toll on Iran, and a regime that had been adamant about withholding from negotiation eventually came to the bargaining table. 444 days after the Americans were taken hostage in Tehran, they were released, but only after President Ronald Reagan had been sworn in. While Carter eventually helped secure the release of the Americans, his inability to rescue them cost him his presidency. In recent years, Carter has become a conservative punching bag as one of the worst presidents America has ever had. Unquestionable contributing factors to this assertion would be the crises in Iran and Afghanistan. They very much overshadowed early diplomatic work in Panama, the Camp David Accords with Egypt and Israel, and taking the next step in nuclear de-escalation with the Soviet Union via the SALT II Treaty. But Carter also began many trends that have long-standing legacy today. His deregulation efforts paved the way for a freer airline market, for example, and lessened restrictive financial practices first instituted during the Great Depression. And although he took a large chunk of the South in the 1976 election, due in part to his Baptist faith, the view of many evangelicals that Carter had failed them through his policies led to the solidifying of the moral majority behind Ronald Reagan in 1980. In reality, while Carter was a likable guy, his election had just as much to do with people's hatred of Nixon and the arrogance he represented as Carter's platform itself. Interestingly, Americans realized through Carter's laissez-faire foreign policy that while Johnson and Nixon certainly abused the power of the presidency, an imperial president was better than the alternative of a hands-off approach, especially when American credibility in the world was at stake.